The desert sun hammered down on the convoy like judgment itself. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves pressed himself against the burning metal of the disabled Humvee, feeling the heat sear through his uniform, while insurgent fire chewed the landscape into dust and shrapnel. His radio crackled with desperate calls from 2nd Platoon, pinned 3 clicks north in a dry riverbed that had become their tomb. The Taliban had them in a perfect kill box, mortars walking closer with each thunderous impact. Reeves had seen enough combat to know when men were about to die, and the voices on that radio carried the hollow edge of soldiers writing their last mental letters home. Command had promised air support 20 minutes ago, then 30, now 45. The sky remained empty, and hope was bleeding out into the sand. When the sound came, it wasn't the screaming turbine whine of an F-16 or the distant thunder of strategic bombers. It was something older, angrier, a deep mechanical roar that seemed to shake the air itself. Reeves looked up through the heat shimmer and spotted it, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Hawkeye 7, coming in so low he could see battle damage scarring its fuselage. Smoke poured from the right engine cowling in thick black ribbons. The aircraft's approach angle was wrong, too steep, too fast. Someone had been shot to hell and was still pressing the attack. Phantom 6 Hawkeye 7, I have visual on your position. Danger close. Recommend you get very small. The voice on the radio was female, calm as someone ordering coffee, with an accent that carried the flat vowels of West Texas or Oklahoma. Something in that steadiness made Reeves believe they might actually survive this. The A-10 roared overhead at 300 feet, trailing smoke like a banner. Reeves caught a glimpse of the pilot's helmet in the cockpit. Then the aircraft banked hard left, presenting its belly to the ridgeline where muzzle flashes had been sparking like angry fireflies. What happened next defied everything Reeves understood about damaged aircraft and wounded pilots. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up with a sound like the sky tearing in half. 30mm rounds shredded the insurgent positions, each 1-second burst delivering enough depleted uranium to disintegrate cover and the men behind it. The A-10's gun runs were surgically precise despite the smoke now pouring from both engines. Hawkeye 7, you are on fire. Recommend immediate RTB. That was the controller finally finding his voice. Negative. Marine still in contact. No emotion. Just fact. The burning came around for another pass, smoke trail arcing across the cloudless sky like a dying comet choosing its impact point. Whoever was flying that aircraft had just made a decision that would echo far beyond this desert battlefield. The second gun run silenced the remaining mortars. The third scattered the ambush entirely. By the time the A-10 climbed away, trailing flames visible even in daylight, 2nd Platoon was already moving, evacuating their wounded under the cover that wounded aircraft had bled to provide. Reeves watched the Thunderbolt limp toward the horizon, losing altitude with each passing second, and wondered if he just witnessed someone's last mission. The radio chatter was already spreading through the tactical net a damaged A-10. A pilot with a death wish or nerves of pure titanium, danger-close gun runs that had carved survival from certain annihilation. Nobody knew yet that the pilot barely made it to the emergency strip at Kandahar, landing with one engine completely dead and the other 30 seconds from catastrophic failure. Nobody knew that Captain Iris Vance had been flying combat missions for 6 years, accumulating 300 hours in the A-10, and had never once left Marines to die because her aircraft was damaged. Nobody knew that her call sign, Hawkeye, wasn't about sharp vision. It was because she'd once spotted an IED through binoculars from 8,000 feet, saving an entire patrol. Nobody knew any of this yet. They would. The story started spreading before Vance's boots touched the ground at Kandahar. The Marines from 2nd Platoon talked. Combat camera footage circulated. Air controllers who'd monitored the engagement passed the details to their replacements. Within 48 hours, every pilot in theater had heard about the A-10 driver who'd pressed a gun run while literally on fire. The unofficial narrative painted her as either suicidally brave or professionally reckless, depending on who was telling the story. The official after-action report used carefully neutral language about aggressive close air support under adverse conditions. Captain Iris Vance filed her own report in characteristically sparse prose, noting engine damage, successful fire mission, emergency landing. She didn't mention that she'd felt the airframe shudder when the fire reached the fuel lines, or that she'd calculated her glide ratio to the emergency strip and known she'd be landing either way-controlled or ballistic. What nobody talked about, what never made it into any report, was how the ground controllers had initially questioned whether Hawkeye 7 should even be in the stack. A female A-10 pilot wasn't rare anymore, but in certain corners of the combat aviation community, quiet doubts still lingered like smoke after a gun run. Could they handle the G-forces in a bombing dive? Did they have the killer instinct for close air support? Would they freeze when ground fire started punching through the titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit? Vance had heard the whispers, the slight pause before her call sign during mission briefs, the way certain pilots always seemed surprised when she walked into the ready room. She'd stopped caring about changing minds with words around her 100th combat hour. You changed minds with results. The mechanics who inspected her aircraft after that mission found 16 separate impact points where anti-aircraft fire had penetrated the fuselage. 3 rounds had come within inches of the flight control hydraulics. One had passed through the canopy frame close enough to her helmet that the ballistic report noted pilot proximity damage. The engine fire had been caused by a fuel line rupture from shrapnel, and she'd continued flying for another 8 minutes after the fire warning illuminated. The maintenance chief, a grizzled master sergeant with 26 years in the Air Force, looked at the damage assessment and said something that would get repeated in every squadron from Bagram to Nelly's. Any pilot who brings this bird home is either lucky as hell or good enough that luck doesn't matter. Vance didn't think of herself as particularly lucky. She'd grown up in Amarillo, Texas, watching thunderstorms roll across the plains and dreaming of flight with the intensity only a landlocked kid can muster. Her father had been a crop duster, the kind of pilot who flew low and slow in aircraft that forgave nothing. He taught her about airspeed and angle of attack before she could drive, taught her that aviation rewarded preparation and punished complacency with absolutely impartial cruelty. When he died in a crash during her sophomore year of college mechanical failure, not pilot error, she'd channeled her grief into the singular focus that got her through Air Force ROTC, undergraduate pilot training, and eventually into the cockpit of the ugliest, toughest, most beautiful aircraft ever designed for close air support. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It didn't break the sound barrier or carry exotic precision munitions. It was built around a gun so powerful that firing it actually slowed the aircraft in flight, wrapped in titanium armor, powered by engines mounted high to survive ground fire, designed from the first blueprint to keep flying when everything else would fall burning from the sky. Pilots joked that the A-10 was a gun with wings bolted on as an afterthought. Vance loved it with an intensity that bordered on spiritual. In the cockpit of a Thunderbolt, she wasn't a woman in a male-dominated field or a pilot constantly proving herself worthy of the call sign on her name tape. She was a weapons system operator, delivering precision violence to protect the men and women fighting on the ground below. The morning after her emergency landing, Vance was back in the squadron-ready room for the daily brief. Her aircraft was in maintenance, awaiting parts and extensive repairs. She expected to be assigned to a desk for a few days, maybe pushed toward a safety stand-down while the incident investigation ran its course. Instead, the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, pointed her toward a different A-10 on the flight line. Hawkeye 7 is down for a week minimum. You're flying Hawkeye 3 today. Same stack, different grid coordinates. Marines need close air support for a compound clearing operation. Wheels up in 90 minutes. No fanfare, no safety lecture, no trauma counseling. Just another mission because the war didn't pause for damaged aircraft or shaken nerves. Vance appreciated that more than Hayes probably knew. She didn't want to be treated like porcelain that might crack under pressure. She wanted to fly, to be useful, to justify the trust that ground forces placed in that call sign when they screamed for air support with bullets snapping past their heads. She grabbed her helmet bag and headed for the flight line, where the new aircraft waited in the harsh morning sun. The crew chief briefing her on Hawkeye 3's systems was a young airman who kept stealing glances at her like she might evaporate if he looked away. Word had obviously spread. She signed off on the maintenance log and climbed into the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 600 times before. Takeoff was smooth. The climb to altitude was routine. The tactical frequency crackled with the usual mix of ground coordination and air traffic control. Vance settled into the mission rhythm, monitoring her systems, reviewing the target area maps on her kneeboard, listening for her call sign to be activated in the stack. Below, the desert unfolded in shades of tan and brown, ancient and indifferent to the violent modern conflict being waged across its surface. She thought about the Marines in 2nd Platoon, wondered if they knew who'd been flying cover for them, wondered if it mattered. Probably not. Ground forces rarely cared about the name behind the call sign. They cared about results, about ordnance on target, about someone willing to fly low and slow through hell itself to get the gun lined up just right. The radio crackled. Hawkeye 7, Badger 2, requesting immediate close air support, troops in contact, grid November Echo 375284. The forward air controller's voice carried controlled urgency. Not panic, but the tight focus of someone managing a rapidly deteriorating situation. Vance checked the coordinates, calculated her approach vector, and keyed her transmit switch. Badger 2, Hawkeye 7, copy troops in contact, inbound from the southwest, 2 minutes. She pushed the throttles forward and dove toward the coordinates, feeling the familiar weight of combat press against her chest. The ground rushed up, details sharpening from abstract terrain into individual buildings, vehicles, fighting positions. Smoke rose from multiple points in the compound. She could see muzzle flashes, tracer fire, the organized chaos of close-quarters combat. Hawkeye 7, Badger 2, be advised enemy is dug in on the north wall, mixed small arms and RPGs. Friendlies are 75 meters south, marked with orange smoke. The controller's voice remained steady, professional, guiding her into the kill box with practiced precision. Vance spotted the orange smoke, identified the friendly positions, calculated the danger close distance. 75 meters was tight. Not impossible, but tight. The margin for error was measured in degrees of arc and milliseconds of trigger discipline. She armed the GAU-8, adjusted her dive angle, and committed to the gun run. The A-10 screamed downward, the targeting pipper settling on the north wall as her airspeed built toward terminal velocity for this altitude and configuration. The moment before firing always felt suspended in amber time stretched, details crystallized. The entire universe narrowed to the relationship between aircraft, target, and the invisible geometry that connected them. Vance squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared, the aircraft shuddered. 30-millimeter rounds impacted the north wall in a precise line that turned concrete and human bodies into expanding clouds of dust and fragments. She pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces compress her vision into a tunnel, then leveled out and came around for a second pass. The radio was already confirming. Hawkeye 7, Badger 2, good hits, enemy suppressed, need you on that position again. She obliged, putting another burst into the same wall, silencing whatever resistance remained. By the time she climbed back to altitude, the Marines were moving forward, securing the compound while the dust still hung in the air. The pattern repeated itself throughout the deployment. Vance flew missions, delivered ordnance, returned to base, maintained her aircraft, slept when she could, and launched again when the call came. The work was brutal and necessary and occasionally beautiful in the way that perfectly executed violence can be when deployed in defense of others. She accumulated flight hours, mission tallies, confirmed kills that she tried not to think about as human beings who'd been alive before her trigger pull. The other pilots in the squadron treated her with quiet respect now, the kind earned through competence demonstrated under fire rather than granted as courtesy. Nobody questioned whether she could handle the aircraft or the mission anymore. The evidence was written in after-action reports and confirmed by the ground forces who kept requesting her call signs specifically. What Vance didn't know was how far her reputation had spread beyond the immediate tactical environment. The Marines from 2nd Platoon had gone home, rotated back to bases in California and North Carolina, and they'd carried the story with them. The tale had evolved in the retelling, acquiring mythic dimensions, a female pilot flying a burning aircraft, pressing gun runs while flames consumed her engines, refusing to leave until every Marine was safe. Details were added, embellished, sometimes invented entirely. The core remained true. Someone had risked everything to save them, and that someone had been flying an A-10 with the call sign Hawkeye 7. The story jumped from Marine Corps bars to Air Force ready rooms to military forums online. It acquired different versions, different narrators, but the emotional center held steady competence, courage, and a refusal to abandon those who depended on that competence. 6 months after the initial incident, Vance was rotated back to the States. She returned to her home station at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia, where the humid air felt alien after months of desert dryness. The squadron she joined was different from her deployed unit, filled with pilots who knew her reputation before they knew her face. The first briefing she attended, the squadron commander introduced her as the pilot who landed an A-10 while it was actively on fire, and the room had responded with applause. She'd felt her face heat, uncomfortable with the attention, wanting to deflect it toward the aircraft maintainers who'd kept her flying or the ground controllers who'd guided her through countless engagements. But the applause continued, and she'd nodded acknowledgement because refusing recognition would have been disrespectful to those offering it. Training missions at Moody felt surreal after combat operations. The ranges were sanitized, the threats simulated, the stakes measured in evaluation scores rather than human lives. Vance flew anyway, maintaining proficiency, teaching younger pilots the tricks that kept you alive when real bullets started flying. She discovered she had a talent for instruction, a patience for explaining the micro-decisions that separated effective close air support from disaster. How to read ground fire and adjust your approach. How to communicate with stressed forward air controllers. How to trust your instruments when visual references disappeared in smoke and dust. How to know when the mission was worth the risk and when discretion was the wiser choice. The younger pilots absorbed everything she offered, hungry for knowledge that came from someone who'd applied theory under the absolute judgment of combat. The Air Force had plans for Captain Iris Vance, though she wouldn't learn the details for another 3 months. Somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery that managed personnel and careers, her file had been flagged for command track, for potential instructor positions at the weapons school, for visibility that would push her into leadership roles whether she wanted them or not. Performance like hers didn't go unnoticed in a military that was perpetually short on combat-experienced pilots. The question wasn't whether she'd be promoted or given increased responsibility. It was whether she'd accept those roles or quietly fade into the background, content to fly and fight without the additional burden of institutional leadership. The answer came during a routine training sortie over the Moody Range complex. Vance was flying with a new lieutenant, a recent A-10 school graduate named Torres who had all the technical skills and none of the combat instinct that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. They were practicing low-altitude gun runs against simulated armor when Torres lined up wrong, coming in too steep with too much airspeed, about to overshoot the target and waste ammunition on empty desert. Vance keyed the radio. Hawkeye 4, Hawkeye 7, check your dive angle, you're high and fast. Abort this pass and come around again. Torres hesitated, ego warring with judgment, then pulled up and circled for another approach. This time the geometry was perfect, the simulated gun run textbook quality. After they landed, Torres approached Vance in the crew room. The younger pilot looked uncomfortable, pride bruised but professionalism intact. "Thanks for the correction up there. I was about to waste that whole pass." Vance nodded. "You'll make that mistake exactly once if someone calls it. You'll make it until you die if everyone lets you continue because they're afraid of hurting your feelings. I'd rather hurt your feelings." Torres smiled, tension breaking. "I heard about what you did in Afghanistan. The burning A-10. Is it true you kept flying for 8 more minutes after the fire started?" Vance considered the question, weighing honesty against humility. The mission wasn't finished. The aircraft was still flying. Simple math. Torres looked at her like she just decoded quantum physics. "That's it, simple math," Vance shrugged. "Complicated math is for people with time to think. In combat, you do what the next 60 seconds requires, then you deal with the 60 seconds after that." The conversation spread, as conversations do in close-knit military units. The new pilots started watching Vance more carefully, noting how she prepared for missions, how she communicated with ground controllers, how she evaluated threats and managed aircraft systems under pressure. She became an unofficial standard, the benchmark against which others measured their own performance. It was a burden she'd never sought but couldn't escape. Excellence created expectations, and expectations created pressure to maintain the standard that had generated those expectations in the first place. Vance dealt with it the only way she knew how, by focusing on the work, staying current on qualifications, and flying every mission like it might be evaluated by someone whose life would depend on her skills tomorrow. 3 months later, the official notification came. Captain Iris Vance was selected for the Fighter Weapons School Instructor Cadre, a position reserved for the top 1% of combat pilots in each airframe. The assignment would take her to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where she'd teach advanced tactics to experienced pilots from across the Air Force. It was a prestigious position, a career accelerator, and a role that would cement her reputation as not just a competent pilot, but as someone who could articulate and transfer the knowledge that made her competent. She accepted the assignment because turning it down would have been professionally suicidal, but privately she wondered if she was ready to shift from operator to educator, from doing to teaching. Nellie sprawled across the Nevada desert like a small city, dedicated to the single purpose of making pilots better at controlled violence. The weapons school occupied a building complex that looked government generic from the outside, but contained some of the most sophisticated tactical knowledge in the Air Force. Vance reported on a Monday morning in September, processing through administrative requirements and orientation briefings with the other new instructors. The group was small, maybe 15 pilots across different airframes, all of them carrying similar combat resumes, all of them chosen because someone in the evaluation chain had decided they represented the institutional standard worth preserving and propagating. She was the only woman in the group, which wasn't surprising. She was also the only A-10 pilot, which was mildly unusual. The others came from F-15s, F-16s, bombers, even a helicopter pilot who'd done things in special operations that remained classified. The chief instructor welcomed them with a speech about responsibility and legacy. "You're here because you know how to win fights. Your job now is teaching others to win the fights they'll face tomorrow. That means you need to be better than good, you need to be articulable. Instinct won't help your students. Theory they can apply will." Vance listened, absorbing the message, understanding that her role had fundamentally shifted. She wasn't the weapon system anymore. She was the knowledge base that would shape future weapon systems. It felt simultaneously empowering and constraining, like being promoted from player to coach in a game where the score was measured in lives preserved through superior tactics. The first class she taught was on close air support in complex terrain. 12 students, all experienced pilots with combat deployments, all of them hungry to learn from someone who'd done it for real under the worst possible conditions. Vance stood at the front of the classroom, aerial imagery of Afghan mountains projected on the screen behind her, and felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. She talked them through a mission she'd flown, breaking down each decision point, explaining the information available at each moment, articulating the risk calculations that had seemed intuitive in the cockpit but required deliberate analysis when extracted and presented for instruction. The students took notes, asked sharp questions, challenged her assumptions. She loved it. The intellectual rigor reminded her why she joined the Air Force in the first place. Not just to fly, but to be part of something larger than individual achievement, to contribute to an institution that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Over the following months, Vance built her reputation at Nellie's the same way she'd built it in combat through consistent excellence and quiet competence. Her classes were known for being demanding but fair, technical but applicable, theoretical but grounded in operational reality. Students requested her courses specifically, wanting to learn from the pilot who'd pressed burning gun runs in Afghanistan and lived to articulate the lessons. She became known for a teaching style that balanced encouragement with uncompromising standards. She'd praise students for small improvements while simultaneously identifying gaps that could kill them in combat. The balance was delicate, requiring constant calibration, but she discovered she had a gift for knowing when to push and when to support, when to correct publicly, and when to pull someone aside for private counseling. Her personal life remained sparse, which suited her fine. Relationships were complicated when your work involved regular deployment to combat zones and unpredictable schedules built around training missions that sometimes started at 3 in the morning. She tried dating civilian men who didn't understand why she couldn't just leave work early or take weekends off. She tried dating military men who understood the demands but brought their own operational tempo that made coordination impossible. Eventually, she'd stop trying, content with friendships, professional relationships, and the occasional acknowledgement that loneliness was the price extracted for the kind of career she'd chosen. Maybe later when she slowed down. Maybe never. It didn't particularly matter. The work mattered. The students mattered. The Marines and soldiers who'd survive future battles because they'd been taught correct tactics mattered. Everything else was negotiable. A year into her instructor assignment, Vance received a request that initially seemed routine. A documentary film crew wanted access to fighter weapons school for a production about close air support evolution. They needed subject matter experts, experienced combat pilots willing to be interviewed on camera. The Public Affairs Office had forwarded her name along with several others. She could decline if she wanted participation was voluntary. But the project description mentioned highlighting the role of women in combat aviation, and Vance understood that visibility mattered even when it made her uncomfortable. Young women considering military aviation needed to see examples, needed to know that the path existed and was survivable. She agreed to the interview, setting aside 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon for filming. The production crew arrived with more equipment than seemed necessary for a simple interview. Lights, cameras, audio recorders, makeup artists who looked at Vance's sun-weathered face and flight suit with barely concealed confusion. The director was a veteran herself, former Army journalist who'd embedded with combat units during the Iraq surge. She understood military culture, knew which questions would generate genuine responses versus scripted public affairs talking points. They set up in a briefing room, Vance sitting in a chair that suddenly felt like a witness stand, cameras pointed at her from 3 different angles. The director started with soft questions background, why she joined the Air Force, what drew her to the A-10. Vance answered honestly, relaxing slightly as she realized this wasn't ambush journalism. Then the director shifted. Tell me about the mission in Afghanistan, the one where your aircraft was on fire. Vance had known this was coming, had prepared mentally for the question, but hearing it spoken aloud still triggered a cascade of sensory memories. The smell of smoke in the cockpit, the fire warning light painting everything red, the calm certainty that she was either landing this aircraft or dying in it, and either outcome was acceptable as long as the Marines got out. She took a breath and started talking, describing the mission in clinical detail, avoiding heroic narrative or dramatic embellishment. Just the facts. Damage sustained, decisions made, results achieved. The director let her talk without interruption, recognizing that authenticity couldn't be coached or scripted. When Vance finished, the director asked one more question. What do you want people to understand about that mission? What's the lesson? Vance considered this carefully, aware that her answer would shape how the story was presented, how she'd be portrayed. She could deflect, minimize, redirect attention toward the Marines she'd supported or the aircraft maintainers who'd kept her flying. Instead, she chose honesty. I want people to understand that competence doesn't care about your gender or your background or what anyone thought about you before you proved yourself. The aircraft doesn't care. The mission doesn't care. The Marines bleeding on the ground don't care. They care about results. Everything else is noise. The director smiled behind the camera. Perfect. We'll use that. The documentary aired 6 months later on a streaming platform that Vance didn't subscribe to. She heard about it from students who'd watched, from friends who sent messages, from family members who suddenly understood what she actually did for a living, beyond the vague descriptions she offered at Thanksgiving dinners. The film used her interview as a narrative anchor, cutting between her clinical description of the Afghanistan mission and dramatic reenactment footage that she found simultaneously flattering and ridiculous. They'd made her look heroic, which made her uncomfortable. They'd also accurately portrayed the reality of close air support, the split-second decisions, the trust between ground forces and air support, the constant calibration of risk versus necessity. The response was overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. Messages flooded her email, her social media accounts, her official Air Force contact channels. Young women considering military service, thanking her for representation. Veterans who'd been in similar situations, sharing their own stories. Activists using her interview to argue for expanded roles for women in combat. Critics arguing she'd been featured because of political correctness rather than merit. The attention was intense and unwanted and completely unavoidable. Vance dealt with it by largely ignoring it, focusing on her teaching responsibilities, letting the public affairs office handle media requests. She'd said what she needed to say. The work continued regardless of how many people watched a documentary about it. But the documentary had consequences she couldn't ignore. The Air Force decided that Captain Iris Vance had become a useful recruiting and public relations asset. They wanted her at air shows, at recruiting events, at public engagements, where she could represent the modern Air Force to audiences who still pictured pilots as exclusively male. She pushed back, arguing that her value was in the classroom, teaching students who'd apply that knowledge in combat. The response from senior leadership was politely immovable. She could continue teaching, but she'd also accept the additional responsibilities that came with being a public face of the institution. It wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in professional courtesy. The air shows were surreal. Vance stood next to static displays of aircraft she'd flown in combat, answering questions from civilians who'd never experienced violence more immediate than an action movie. Children asked if she'd ever shot anyone. She deflected, talking about supporting ground forces and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Adults asked if it was hard being a woman in a male-dominated field. She answered honestly. Sometimes yes, mostly no. It depended on whether people cared more about competence or conformity to expectations. Teenage girls asked if she was scared when she flew. She told them fear was information, not paralysis, and that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The conversations were exhausting and occasionally rewarding, and completely divorced from the work she actually valued. Between public appearances, Vance continued teaching at Nellie's. Her students remained her priority, the reason she'd accepted this assignment in the first place. She watched them grow from competent pilots to exceptional tacticians, watched them absorb lessons and develop instincts that would keep them alive when theory met reality. Some of them deployed and sent her messages from combat zones, thanking her for specific pieces of advice that had proven crucial in actual engagements. Those messages mattered more than any award or public recognition. They were confirmation that the work had meaning, that knowledge transferred in a Nevada classroom could save lives in Afghan valleys or Syrian desert, or wherever American forces would be asked to fight next. Promotion came inevitably. Captain became major, bringing increased responsibility and decreased cockpit time. Vance accepted the rank and the paperwork that came with it, understanding that progression meant trading direct operational involvement for broader institutional impact. She supervised other instructors now, built curriculum, coordinated with other weapons school divisions to ensure close air support doctrine remained current and relevant. The work was important, but she missed flying missions, missed the immediate feedback of successful tactics applied under pressure. Staff work provided intellectual satisfaction, but lacked the visceral confirmation that came from rounds on target and Marines evacuating safely under cover that she'd provided. 5 years after the burning A-10 incident, Vance was teaching a class on risk management in close air support when a student asked the question she'd been expecting for years, but had never satisfactorily answered. "Major Vance, when your aircraft was on fire over Afghanistan, how did you decide to keep flying instead of ejecting? What was the calculation?" The classroom went quiet, everyone aware they were asking about the moment that had defined her public reputation. Vance looked at the student, a young captain with 2 deployments and sharp tactical instincts, and decided on complete honesty. "There wasn't a calculation, not the way you mean it. I had Marines in contact, I had ordnance remaining, I had an aircraft that was still responding to inputs. Ejecting meant abandoning people who'd called for help. Staying meant risking my life for theirs. That's not a math problem with a correct answer. That's a values problem. What kind of pilot did I want to be? What kind of person? I chose to be the kind who stays until the mission is complete or the aircraft won't fly anymore."